Good evening and welcome to our UKFPO webinar, which we're doing in conjunction with colleagues from the General Medical Council. My name is Mike Masding. I'm a consultant physician and I am also National Clinical Director of the UKFPO. Throughout my time in medical education, working with resident doctors of all sorts of grades, I've often come across what I consider to be misconceptions and myths about how the GMC works and what sort of things might happen to a doctor should clinical or professional behaviour not be at the standard one might expect, or indeed even in some cases where a doctor has made an honest mistake or something might have inadvertently gone wrong in their care with a patient. Some years ago now, in the deanery in which I work, Andrew Hoyle from the GMC came down and gave us a really interesting talk about how the GMC fitness to practice mechanisms work. And I thought it would be a really good opportunity for foundation doctors and faculty to hear some of that, to try and dispel some of the myths and misconceptions about how the GMC works. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel of the UKFPO. But for those of you who are live, there is the opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A tab. So if you think of things that you would like to ask Andrew, who is here to represent the GMC, then please type them there and we will come to those a little bit later. But first of all, I'd like to bring in Andrew, who's going to give a bit of a introduction into fitness to practice mechanisms at the GMC, and then we're going to have a discussion between the two of us after that. Andrew, thanks very much for giving up your time. I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Mike, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining. It's always a pleasure to be able to speak to fellow colleagues who are in the healthcare profession. So thank you for inviting me. It's a delight to be with you. So I thought what might be helpful is if I just very, very quickly give you a little bit of background about me. And then I was going to just share some slides and do a short, and I do mean short, sort of overview of some of the things that we do in fitness to practice at the GMC. And then, Mike and I will have a chat and take questions, etc. So my background is I'm a doctor. I'm registered with a license to practice. I stopped seeing patients probably completely about 5 years ago now. And I've been at the GMC for 3.5 years, give or take. And before that, I was head of medical law for part of the UK government. And I'm also a barrister and I have a practicing certificate. I specialise in medical negligence and medical law and regulatory law. So before I joined the GMC, I used to sit on fitness to practice panels as a medical member, and I also used to sit as a PLAB examiner, but I don't do that since joining because it would be a conflict of interest. And I also do a variety of other things. So I came to the GMC, like I say, in sort of May 2022, I think it was. And my role there is that I'm an assistant director in fitness to practice, and I'm in charge of what they call decisions. So I'm the assistant director in charge of decisions. And that means that I lead the team of case examiners who are the people that at the end of a GMC's fitness to practice investigation, they make a statutory decision as to whether one of our registrants will go forwards to a fitness to practice hearing or not. And they can do some other things as well, but that's broadly the role. So what I'll do, let me share some slides. Okay, so we'll just have a quick run through and I'll try not to bore everybody too much. So why does the GMC exist? Well, it exists because the Medical Act sets out in law that it must exist. And the Medical Act that we operate under at the moment is from 1983. And as you can tell, that's quite a while ago, probably not fit for purpose nowadays. and the Department of Health are currently looking at adapting and changing the Medical Act so that it's more fit for purpose and gives us greater discretion and makes the process better, really. But that's a work in progress. So at the moment we sit under the Medical Act, and the Medical Act sets out what the GMC has to do, and that's what we call in GMC public protection. And those are the three areas that the GMC exists to carry out, and you can read those for yourselves. It wasn't until I started sitting on fitness to practice panels before joining the GMC that I probably read the Medical Act and got my head around it. But one of the things that always struck me when I was reading this is the one word that's not in those three criteria is the word doctor. And that's because the GMC doesn't exist to represent doctors. That's the preserve of the BMA and the defence organisations. The GMC exists and is instructed in law to protect the public. It's a patient safety organisation. And we do that by a variety of mechanisms, such as making sure people are fit to join the register in the first place. We govern parts of medical education. We, through revalidation and appraisal, ensure that people are fit to remain on the register. And right at the very end of the process, we address concerns that are raised, and that's the bit that involves fitness to practice. We set out what the standards we expect our registrants to adopt, and that's listed in Good Medical Practice. It was updated last year. It's called Good Medical Practice, not Perfect Medical Practice or Excellent Medical Practice. It's Good Medical Practice for a reason, because we just expect our registrants to behave in a reasonable and responsible way. So in fitness practice, we investigate concerns where there is an ongoing or current risk to the public, and that's one of those three parts of public protection, those three boxes that you can see. But not every departure from good medical practice warrants regulatory action, only those where there is a current and ongoing risk to the public. So at the moment, we have around 390,000, slightly more doctors on the register, and we get about 10,000 complaints in fitness to practice every year. That's rising, and it's rising quite rapidly, and it's rising across all healthcare regulators. We analyze all of that. We can't identify a specific trend. The rise in complaints is largely from members of the public. Why that is, we don't know. There's not one particular type of complaint that has risen. It seems whether it's just some general dissatisfaction with healthcare services, who knows, but complaints are rising across the healthcare sector. And I think this year, will be probably one of the highest number of complaints that the GMC's seen. So it used to be about 10,000 a year. It's gone up over the last couple of years. The law says that we have absolutely no discretion. We must consider every concern that we receive. That's what the law states. So out of all of those, we have to consider every one of them. As I say, most come from members of the public. Complaints from members of the public are less likely to progress through our system than complaints from ROs, employers, the police, etc. Why is that? It's not because we take complaints from members of the public less seriously. We treat all complaints the same. It's just the fact that complaints from employers, ROs, tend to have been through a local process first, and so by the time they get to us, they tend to be at the more serious end. We shut down around 84% of complaints straight away, and that's usually because either they don't fall within our jurisdiction or they're not matters that concern the regulator. So we don't care if you're having a boundary dispute with your neighbour. We don't care if you accidentally reverse your car into a car park, into another car in the supermarket. So most concerns we shut down straight away. Out of those 10 to 12,000 concerns we get each year, we formally investigate around 850 to 900. And then last year, out of the 393, nearly 400,000 doctors on the register, 169 cases were referred to a fitness to practice tribunal, of which 67 doctors were removed from the register. So that's 67 out of nearly 400,000. And those are doctors normally who have either committed serious criminal offences or very serious misconduct. So child sexual abuse images on their computers, etc. We are very alive to the fact that the profession is very concerned about how we take into consideration in complaints the context in which they are working and the pressures and difficulties of working within a healthcare system. And we are very alive to the fact that working in healthcare, particularly in the NHS, is difficult, it's hard. There are lots of moving pieces, there are lots of resource implications. It's a difficult job. And we know the profession is very nervous about how the GMC views clinical errors. And it is absolutely right. We do look at single clinical errors, but they tend not to progress through the fitness to practice process to the very end. And one statistic which I wish more people were aware of is that in the last 10 years, in the last decade, we have only removed one doctor from the register for a pure clinical error, absent other features. And that was a doctor who made a series of clinical errors, was suspended, came back on the register, made an identical series of clinical errors, and then disengaged completely from the fitness to practice process. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I'll just show you this slide. This shows sort of the types of investigations by stage of career. So there's some interesting features. Investigations on grounds of criminality sort of begin, well, they start high and drop off. I'm never quite sure what the reason for that is, whether people become less criminal as they get older, or whether they just become more adept at not being caught. So I'm not sure what it is. But you can see there the sort of figures, and that we do analyze in terms of what specialties and other features as to when you're likely to be investigated, but it's just to give you a bit of a view. So this is very important, I think. The law does not allow the regulator to punish doctors for past behaviour. That is unlawful. What we have to do is look at the future risk to patients, the future risk to public protection, those three overarching limbs that the law says we must look at. So for us, that's why insight and remediation is extremely important, and it can certainly change how a case progresses, because how a doctor responds when something goes wrong gives a very good indication as to how they are likely to respond in future should an error happen again. So if a doctor shows proper and good evidence of insight and remediation, that can dramatically reduce the risk to future public protection. So that can make a difference to cases. It's very important to us to look at how a doctor responds. Public confidence is an area that we are charged with ensuring a standard is met, but it's not well understood necessarily by the profession. So the law says, not the GMC, the law says that as a member of a regulated profession, you are expected to conduct yourself to a higher standard than the general public, both in your public and in your private lives. That is the law. And that is why at times we do look into actions concerning doctors that have occurred in their private lives that don't affect patient care, because the law says that all regulated professionals have to conduct themselves to a higher standard than the public. And I'll just mention dishonesty, because cases of dishonesty involving doctors do hit the press and social media quite a lot. Again, the law, not the GMC, the law says that dishonesty is one of the most serious acts of misconduct, and even a single act of dishonesty, for even a single act, erasure is likely to be appropriate, particularly if there's a lack of insight. So dishonesty is taken very seriously by the courts, and that's why we also look at dishonesty and take it seriously. Although, and I'll come to this, we try and work quite hard to be compassionate where we can in regulation, and we've adjusted our guidelines recently about dishonesty so that very low level dishonesty we can take a more proportionate view of. So I won't bore you too much with this. As I said, we get about 10 to 12,000 complaints a year. we close about 84% straight away. We don't tell doctors when they've had a complaint made against them. That's because we know the enormous stress that being contacted by the GMC can place doctors under. So we only tell them if their complaint is going to progress to an investigation. Because the Medical Act's quite old, we introduced a few years ago a process called provisional inquiry, which is where at triage, we're not quite sure whether we can close it or whether we have to progress it. So provisional inquiry allows us to make some very initial further inquiries to get a bit of evidence. And at that stage, we can shut down, like I said, about another 400 complaints at that stage. So out of about 12,000 complaints each year, only 850 to 900 go forwards to a full investigation. At the end of that investigation, the doctor is invited to make their representations, to tell us their side of the story, explain what's happened, provide the evidence they want to provide to us. At the end of all of that, my team, who are the case examiners, will then look at that evidence and decide whether a doctor goes forwards to a fitness to practice hearing or not. There are always two case examiners. One is lay, the other is medical. The medical lay case examiners are always a currently practicing doctor. So they work for us 2 or 3 days a week and as doctors, usually in the NHS, for the rest of the time. I won't labour you too much longer because we'll sit down and have a proper chat, but I'll just mention some of the things that we've tried to do over recent years to be more compassionate in how we deal with doctors and all our registrants who are facing an investigation. It is limited. Once you are in the fitness to practice process, you are in a legal process. So we can't sort of brush over everything or cut corners. So for example, we have to call allegations allegations. We can't call them something else. But where we can, we've tried to soften the language that we use. We offer support. So as I said, we shut down most cases. We only carry out a full investigation when it's absolutely necessary. We introduced a provisional inquiry stage, so we can shut down about another 400 to 450 before proceeding to an investigation. Now we offer anyone under investigation a single point of contact. We give them a telephone call and a person to contact throughout the process so that the process can be explained. If there's any questions, they have a single point of contact to talk to. We fund. We don't get involved in it, but in order that it keeps its independence, but we pay for the doctor support service, which is run by the BMA, and that is to support doctors who are in our fitness to practice process. We have different mechanisms to deal with doctors who are unwell and can pause an investigation to allow doctors to get treatment. And as I said, we continue to review our tone, the language, how we communicate with doctors. We also have safeguarding procedures and offer support to other users of the fitness to practice service, such as patients or complainants, witnesses, children who are in the process, etc. The General Medical Council investigates the complaint. It is the Medical Practitioners Tribunal Service that actually carries out fitness to practice hearings. MPTS in law is part of the GMC under the Medical Act, but it operates completely independently. It runs out of a different building, it has different staff, and it runs the independent fitness to practice tribunals. Fitness to practice tribunal hearings are heard by 3 people, one of whom is always a doctor, or at least one of whom. Don't worry about that, that just sets out what I've just said. So finally, I'll just finish on this. Just quick run through about general points when you hear about cases on social media, in the press. It is the GMC's case to prove. The doctor is innocent until proven guilty, for want of a better phrase. That's a criminal test. We don't apply a criminal standard, we apply a civil standard, but it just helps you understand the doctor has nothing to prove. You don't even need to turn up to your fitness to practice hearing. You'd be ill-advised not to, of course, but you don't have to. The GMC has to prove the case of the fitness to practice hearing. It is unfortunately adversarial. We live in an adversarial system of justice and have done for 1,000 years. That's how the law works. We test the evidence. So doctors, witnesses are subject to cross-examination by both sides. That's how the law operates, and we can't change that. The one most useful thing I was taught when I arrived at the GMC, which is absolutely true, is that the case you see in the media and on social media is never the case that was actually heard. And finally, I'll just say that cases are living beings. So evidence in legal cases changes throughout the case. So at various different decision points, for example, the decision to close or open a case at triage, the decision to carry out or not carry out a full investigation, to refer or not to refer to a hearing. The evidence that decision makers have at each of those decision points changes quite often as the case progresses, because different pieces of evidence come forward. People suddenly engage where they haven't engaged, or witnesses drop away when previously they wouldn't, or expert witnesses change their evidence, etc. So decision points change. So look, I've probably said enough. We can come back to personal beliefs. I will stop sharing with some questions and answers. So I'll just pause there and wait to speak to Mike. But I can't hear you, Mike, because you're on mute.
On mute. So, Andrew,
you've gone back on mute, I think
so. Some really fascinating points you've made there. Some really interesting stats, and I think it's fair to say, as a practicing clinician, you've shown that the statistical chance of undergoing fitness to practice investigation, and indeed something I often hear, particularly doctors new in their career, are terribly worried about being struck off, are really very low statistically. That's not to say that any doctor should be complacent and we should all be behaving to those standards. But I think I have heard many times young resident doctors being terribly worried about being, as they put it, struck off, when in fact statistically that's extremely unlikely. In terms of some sort of specific issues, Andrew, one thing I have dealt with a number of resident doctors as a medical educator is where they've had issues around drugs or alcohol. Are there any specific fitness to practice sort of issues where a doctor has been using drugs or indeed, issues around alcohol?
Yes. So we have a different process for doctors who have health conditions, and health conditions for us in fitness practice very frequently revolve around drug or alcohol misuse. Obviously not purely that, but those are quite a large number of them. And in trying to be a compassionate regulator, we recognize that this happens, and we try very hard, whilst balancing the risks to the public, to return doctors with drug and alcohol misuse difficulties back to work in a safe working environment where we can. So what I mean by that is where we can do so safely, we will ask doctors to engage in what we call undertakings. So that may be to subject themselves to regular drug testing, to engage with one of our psychiatrists, to undergo regular alcohol testing, to be supervised at work, so that we can assure ourselves that whilst those doctors get treatment, that patients are protected, that the doctor is not misusing drugs or alcohol whilst they're seeing patients. It also allows us, where alcohol or drug misuse or health conditions are combined with misconduct, to take a more compassionate approach. So by that, a frequent, it is a frequent example. I mean, they're not large numbers, but when you're talking about drug misuse, this happens. Where, for example, you'll get a doctor who is battling with a drug misuse problem, for example, steals an ampule of ketamine from work. What we will try not to do, if it's appropriate, is not go down a misconduct route about theft for that stealing one ampule of ketamine, whereas we recognize that's part of their drug addiction and their drug misuse problem. So where there's cogent evidence that their health condition is linked to the misconduct, and where it's safe for patients for us to do so, we won't go down the misconduct route. We will deal with it as a health matter. Now, if you steal 100 ampules of ketamine and start selling them on the street corner, that's a completely different matter. That you're not going to go down the health route. You're going to go firmly down the misconduct route. But it allows us to try and return doctors to work in a supportive way. But it relies on doctors having insight, on them recognizing that they have a health condition, and on them being willing to engage with us so that we can monitor it and control it and be satisfied that patients aren't put at risk. The one thing that I would say that is one of our, when I say red lines, we don't have absolute red lines because in law, everything is judged on a case-by-case basis. But if you are under the influence of drugs or alcohol at work, then for us, that puts patients directly at risk, and that will almost always lead to a fitness to practice hearing referral. So just to set that out.
Really interesting, and it's very clear that, as you just mentioned, that it's very much on a case-by-case basis. And of course, rather like clinical practice, there will be an element of uncertainty about which particular sort of bit the misbehavior may fall. But it's interesting that you want to try and take that compassionate approach in order to the ultimate aim, I guess, is always that we want doctors to be working for the good of patients and working to do so. So to getting them back to work is really important.
It is, but I would say our ultimate aim is to protect the public.
Okay.
As I said, that's our duty,
Yes.
is to protect the public, not to protect the doctor or the
That's
profession.
right.
So where we feel the public are
Yeah.
at risk, we will take action. Hence why, if you're under the influence whilst
Yes.
at work and treating patients, that for us is almost always a fitness to practice referral.
And of course, the vast majority of doctors, that would never be an issue at any point in their career, but really important to take that seriously. And along similar lines, I have heard doctors entering our profession, younger doctors, foundation doctors, saying, well, it's something that happened in my private life. Why should the GMC be interested in this? It's nothing to do with treating patients. It's what I'm doing in my off time. What would be your reasons for still taking that seriously?
So fundamentally, because as I said in the short presentation, that is the law. So the law requires doctors and other regulated professionals to have a higher standard of behaviour than the general public in their public and their private lives. But it's really about having public confidence in the profession. So, for example, some of the things that we see occurring in private lives which don't necessarily extend into treatment of patients are things such as domestic abuse. And our concern there is if a doctor carries out an action in their private lives, that may translate into how they would view or treat or consider a patient that they are seeing in their clinical lives. So, for example, if a doctor is a perpetrator of domestic abuse and domestic violence in their home environment, we have to consider, well, how is that doctor likely to treat a patient who is coming to seek help from them if they are a victim of domestic abuse? And the same with sexual misconduct, the same with treatment of children, etc. So there's an element of public confidence, because one of the things that we have to satisfy ourselves with, and one of the requirements of all regulators, of regulated professionals, is that we must maintain confidence that the public have in the profession as a whole. And part of that is that the confidence the public must take in the profession is more important than the fate of any one single member of that profession. But the law is absolutely clear that your conduct in your private life should be considered by regulators and can extend into your professional life.
Yeah. Out of interest, what other professions does that apply to, where there a higher standard of behaviour?
All regulated professionals, architects, accountants, barristers, solicitors. And the reason for that is, throughout as we go through our lives, we all engage the services of other regulated professionals like lawyers, accountants, etc.
Yeah.
And we know nothing about that individual, save they are a member of a profession, and we trust them on the basis of the membership of that profession. And that's why, it's a fundamental tenet of the profession, of particularly of medicine, is the trust between the doctor and the patient. And so we are charged with ensuring that the public can have trust in the medical profession. And that's why the law requires a higher standard. And it also, members of professions might disagree with this, but the law, the reason in part the law imposes that is the law says that members of professions obtain benefits by virtue of that membership, be it status in society, financial benefits, etc. And there's a quid pro quo to that, which comes with the standards that are expected of you. Now, whether
And this
you
is,
believe that, I mean, that's a matter for
yeah,
individuals, but that's what the law says.
and this is something that's been around for thousands of years, isn't it?
Yeah.
In terms of professions, and of course, you, Andrew, are double regulated as being a doctor
I
and
am.
a barrister.
Yeah.
So
I am.
yeah, I'm sure your behaviour is absolutely
Sure,
exemplary.
I can fall from grace twice, can't I?
In terms of if a doctor's arrested for something, and of course that can cover a whole multitude of different behaviours from serious criminal activity. But recently people have been arrested at protests about things, and would the GMC be automatically informed by the police or the arresting authority, or is there a sort of threshold for which they would do so?
So it's a bit random. So generally, we wouldn't be informed at the point of arrest. I mean, there isn't, to my knowledge, a mechanism for that. And we don't actually expect registrants to inform us if they have been arrested. The good medical practice states that you must inform us at the point at which you are charged with an offence, or if you are convicted of an offence, or if you accept caution, etc. But at the point of arrest, it's not something that we require registrants to tell us. Now, if you do tell us, because we have no discretion and we must consider everything that we receive, then we will consider it. So there isn't a mechanism. We're usually not told when people are charged. It depends what there are legal mechanisms in place, which isn't to do with the GMC, it's to do with the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, about them informing regulators when regulated professionals are charged or convicted. So if it's a serious offence, particularly sexual offences, serious violence, child sexual abuse images, etc., we do get informed by the police. But again, it's a bit, as all these things are, it's a bit dependent on which police service, etc. So I wouldn't say there's a fail-safe mechanism, but that's why registrants are under a duty to tell us at the point at which they're charged or convicted or accept caution, and that extends worldwide. So if you are holidaying overseas and are charged or accept a penalty for a crime overseas, which had it occurred in the United Kingdom would be a crime, then you are expected to tell us.
Yeah.
And the only other thing I would say, just to add on to that, is the law says that for the GMC, that if you are convicted of a criminal offence and you receive a custodial sentence, even if that is a suspended sentence, you go directly to a fitness to practice hearing.
That's very clear, and helpful to hear. You mentioned in your talk a number of times about good medical practice. You've just mentioned it now. Is it probably fair to say that if one adheres to, well, reads it in the first place, but then adheres to good medical practice, that your chances of any of this happening are really infinitesimally small?
Yes, is the simple answer. I think, and I laugh when you say read good medical practice. I mean, we all live in the real world. I'm not sure when I first started out as a doctor that I sat down and read each and every word of good medical practice. I recognize that. Unfortunately, not reading it and not having knowledge of it, as with all laws, is no defense. If you fall foul of it, whether you knew about it or not, tough, you've fallen foul of it. So I would encourage everyone to read it. And there are useful guides that we put out there about the use of social media, ethical guidance about dealing with conflicts with patients, confidentiality matters. There's all sorts of useful guidance in it. But you're right. I mean, if you stick to good medical practice, then you're not going to fall foul of our fitness to practice processes. And so it's well worth keeping an eye on and having a look at. I would, even though I will be absolutely honest and say I'm not sure I entirely did that when I first qualified, I'd encourage you to have a look.
I'm sure that was the case for me as well, Andrew. Although now, as an educator, I do have a link to it and do actually refer to it on a regularly frequent basis to cite, particularly around behaviours in the workplace. To say this is not just my opinion about how one should treat one's colleagues and other members of other professions, but actually it's in good medical practice. One should do that. And you mentioned there social media, and of course, a relatively new phenomenon. Our foundation doctors joining now are social media natives. They've known social media throughout their lives, whereas I guess for some of us of my age, it still seems like a new phenomenon. There is GMC guidance, and does that? Are you seeing more cases around fitness to practice around social media, and what sort of things? Obviously you can't cite specific cases, but what sort of things are people doing that might lead them to a fitness to practice investigation on social media?
So it's absolutely fine to use social media. It's absolutely fine to use it to communicate. It's fine to use it to lobby, to protest about matters. It's fine to go on protest. But what you have to do is ensure that your conduct on social media doesn't disrupt the confidence that the public can place in the profession. And you have to make sure that you treat your colleagues that you may be communicating with on social media respectfully and kindly, as we ask you to in good medical practice. It's also important that if you hold yourself as a doctor publicly on social media and you're giving advice, then people will likely follow that advice because you are a doctor, if you're giving clinical advice, etc. So my advice would be that read our guidance on how to use it, but fundamentally be very careful with what you are putting out there, because the moment it's out there, that's it. There's no pulling it back. It goes out potentially to thousands of people. And we are well aware that comments on social media can be fleeting, they can be poorly thought out, likes, retweets, reliking, all of that. But it doesn't detract from the fact that when those comments are looked at in black and white in the cold stark of day, the meaning behind them is often lost. It can be misunderstood. It can be taken out of context. And I think the areas that we're having difficulty with at the moment is when doctors are becoming very impassioned about causes close to their heart and are making comments on social media that are either offensive, seriously offensive, unprofessional, poor use of language, bullying, harassment, all of that, because it's whether it's on social media or whether you're doing it in front of people in a room full of colleagues, the impact is there. And in one sense, the impact's great on social media because the evidence is often there in black and white, forever. So I just urge people to temper how they conduct themselves. Just remember that statement there is on social media is there for the public to see. So if the public are likely to lose their confidence in the profession because of what is said, or if your behavior is likely to be viewed as unprofessional, then you could well end up having some concerns raised with the regulator. So I'd just be careful. But it's absolutely right that people have a right to freedom of speech. We fully support that. It's absolutely right that people can go and protest, they can lobby, they can do all of that, but they need to conduct themselves in a professional manner. Just be polite, be kind, be considerate to other views is all I would say.
And lots of what we've seen on social media, unfortunately, gets escalated to the point where it's none of those things. But would you say that the principle that the law would require people in regulated professions such as medicine or law or architecture or others, that similarly on social media one would expect a slightly higher level of discourse than the general public, for want of a better word.
That's absolutely right. Good medical practice applies the same whether it's in person or on social media. The law applies the same. So you know, if you have it makes no difference in that sense. The standards we expect are the standards. You don't get away with a lower standard because you've said something on social media.
I always feel if I wouldn't say it to somebody's face, I'm not going to put it on social media, and I don't seem to.
I mean, my advice would be don't use social media, but of course that's that shows my age. So
yes,
I recognise that's pointless advice, but there we are.
Yes, and you sort of similarly around this is around people's personal beliefs and how that can impact. And again, what might be said is that it's to do with my personal beliefs. It's nothing to do with how I would treat patients. But is it something to do with the fact that doctors make judgments and deal with uncertainty all the time, and that if they're making a poor judgment in their private life in how they express their personal beliefs, it could translate into patients? Something around that?
I don't think it's necessarily about judgment. It's about professionalism and public confidence.
Okay.
So by all means, go and protest about things that are close to your heart or you think are wrong. By all means, go and lobby, use social media to do that, or go in person. But if you transgress the law, you know, so if you go and, I don't know, go on a protest and then commit an act of criminal damage, if the courts convict you for that, as I said, with a conviction, you're likely to end up as a form of misconduct in front of your regulator. So for us, it's not what we have. I mean, you know, we have, as long as the topic is a lawful topic, we have no interest in what an individual is protesting about. What matters to us is the mode by which they go about it. So as long as they protest lawfully, and as long as their actions don't risk the confidence the public can have in the profession, then that's fine.
And just to be clear, this would apply to lots of other professions, not just doctors, because I think often doctors feel it's just us, but no, this would appeal.
It's standard sort of regulatory law. Regulated professionals, the same for barristers and solicitors, etc. I mean, how different regulators go about things is slightly different because the laws are set out slightly different, but as a general principle, it's the same. Doctors aren't singled out in that regard.
And again, a relatively new thing that didn't happen for most of my training is that doctors are now expected to keep a portfolio of evidence, which includes reflections. Can that be used as evidence in fitness to practice investigations? Is it used, or is are you looking more for sort of observations and accounts from people, outside?
So when it comes to your appraisals, portfolios, revalidation portfolios, etc., we don't ask to see those in fitness practice. They don't form part of our evidence. However, there are two caveats to that. So one is we, as I said right at the beginning, insight and remediation is very important to us. So evidence of remediation, quite often we don't ask for it, but quite often doctors will volunteer aspects of their appraisal, i.e. they've undertaken X, Y, and Z courses, or they've reflected with their appraiser. So there are times when doctors themselves or their representatives, their legal representatives, will suggest that they do provide some evidence which may be part of their appraisal to support insight and remediation, for example, but we don't ask for it. But if they choose to disclose it and if it's helpful to their case, then obviously we consider it. The only other thing I would say is, so as far as the GMC and the fitness practice process is concerned, we don't ask for it. However, if your case goes to the High Courts and not to a fitness to practice hearing, they don't ask for them at fitness to practice hearings either. But if, for example, your case goes before a High Court or before a criminal court, that's completely different. The courts can ask for whatever they wish. So if the High Court judge wants to see your appraisal, well, you're going to have to disclose it. but that's nothing to do with fitness practice. That's to do with the court system.
Yeah, and I think again that's often, I would reflect that that is often something that people are really worried about, particularly if they are reflecting on where something has gone wrong in their own evidence, their own portfolio, their own appraisal folder. But that's really really helpful to know that it won't be asked for, but you can give it as part of your evidence that of how you've behaved, I guess.
Yeah, and the reason we don't ask for it is that we recognise that part of patient safety is being able to have open conversations when things, have gone wrong. And we accept people make mistakes. We all make mistakes, don't we? So, but it's part of learning from those and reflecting on them. And that I've just reminded myself, forgive me, just to add on to that, that's one of the reasons why when I said earlier, we do look at single clinical errors, but they rarely progress all the way through our fitness practice process. That's because, as I said, we don't punish doctors for past behaviour. We look at the future risk to patients. And for almost every doctor, if something happens that harms a patient or they make a clinical mistake, every doctor, almost without exception, does everything in their power to ensure that that mistake will never happen again. So when we look at future risk, the risk falls away because the doctor's done some training, relearned, reflected, shown insight, etc. So yeah, and so the appraisal forms part of that whole system of patient safety, and that's one of the reasons that we don't ask for it. So as to not in any way interfere with how the appraisal process might benefit patients.
And of course, most healthcare professionals are absolutely distraught when something goes wrong.
Absolutely.
And we are looking at as you showed in your slides, a very small subset of doctors, of healthcare professionals who would be thinking otherwise. The vast majority, in my experience, get very upset. And as you say, would do anything for to try and prevent a similar episode happening.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, I mean, finally, from me, we haven't had any questions, but people are very welcome to put them in the questions and answers tab if they would like to. But on a number of occasions, you've talked about insight and remediation. Why is that so important when something goes wrong? That the doctor shows some insight into their own behaviour and take appropriate remedial action. Why is that such an important thing for the GMC?
Because what we're tasked to do in fitness to practice is to look at the future risk to patients. And as I was saying earlier, how a doctor responds when something goes wrong gives a very good indication as to how they are likely to respond in future should something go wrong again. And so when a doctor makes a mistake, and as I say, we all make mistakes, when a doctor makes a mistake, if they can demonstrate that they understand the significance of that mistake, the impact it's had on patients, the impact it might have had on colleagues, and if they can demonstrate that they've taken action to ensure or to dramatically reduce the risk of that ever happening again, that for us is very reassuring when we look at the future risk an individual may present to public protection. So, it's about going on a course or relearning how to do a procedure or anything, any form of CPD or talking to colleagues, having a supervisor, speaking to a mentor, anything like that just goes to mitigate that future risk. That is reassuring for us. Now, clearly it doesn't, if you've committed an act of serious misconduct, there's a limit, and there's case law about all this. There's a limit to how much insight and remediation will matter, and that's one of the reasons that dishonesty, as I was talking about before, is difficult, because the courts take a view that dishonesty is a personality trait, and it is therefore extremely difficult to remediate dishonesty. And so dishonesty very often ends up at a much more serious level, because you can't easily remediate dishonesty. And that, as I say, that all these principles are undermined by, are supported by underlying case law.
And if someone, I'm trying to think of how one might phrase this, but if someone was dishonest but then owned up to it and showed some insight and said, I'm not going to do it again, that would have some mitigation.
It depends on the case, but yes, it might have some mitigation. The courts might take a view, well, people only say they're not going to do it again at the time that they get caught.
Yes.
So I think, you know, it depends. You do sometimes get cases where people have been dishonest, they haven't been caught, but they own up to it anyway. I mean, that's you know, more reassuring. But dishonesty is slightly peculiar in the sense that it is difficult to remediate. It's not to say it's impossible. There are times when you can, but it is generally difficult.
It's an interesting parallel that in medical education, when we're looking at individual resident doctors and their progress, we look at the same things. We look at that we acknowledge that not everyone will get everything right all the time. That's just not how it works as a doctor. It's your reaction to a mistake, it's your reaction to feedback about your performance, it's how you would want to remediate it, and showing some insight into one's own I'm not even going to say deficiencies, one's own just where we're not quite up to speed, but we'll get there, is exactly the same. And where we have had doctors who really struggle in their training, it is exactly the same things. Dishonesty is quite a common cause, but also where they show no insight into their own shortcomings, is where doctors often struggle to progress.
Yeah, I think that's very, very analogous. Yeah.
Well, I think we've come to the end of the time. We haven't got any more questions. Andrew, thank you so much for giving up your time. It's some really interesting and I hope insightful thoughts about fitness practice that I'm sure will have been of interest to our audience and those watching the recap on YouTube. And I hope it will reassure doctors that as we said, if you continue to practice within good medical practice, if you continue to be a good, kind, helpful colleague to other doctors, then you know, without being complacent, the chances of undergoing fitness to practice issues are really very, very small. So thank you very much indeed. Likewise to GMC colleagues who helped set this up. Thank you very much to the UKFPO team for, as ever, doing all the work behind the scenes. Thanks for those of you who came and are watching online. If you have any feedback, there's an email address there. There's also a link to our Humans of the Foundation Programme ebook, which is available, which hopefully you'll find interesting reading. For those of you live, enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hope you'll come to future UKFPO webinars as the year goes on. Thank you very much.